Always Jane, a story about love that was there. All along, there are certain Saturdays in autumn when the air smells like memory itself. This was one of those days. Maya Torres pulled her aging Honda to the curb in front of 428 Sycamore Street, where a hand-painted sign read, "Estate Sale," in careful letters. The Victorian house behind it looked tired but dignified, the way old houses do when they've witnessed decades of life and are now ready to let go of their stories, piece by piece. She'd only been in Willow Creek for 3 weeks, having taken a job at the local newspaper after years of fighting for bylines in Boston. The pace here was different, slower. She was still adjusting to the silence. "Oh, this is perfect." Sophie Chen appeared at her elbow, already holding a vintage teacup. Sophie lived 2 doors down from Maya's rental and had the kind of energy that made instant friendship feel inevitable. "Look at all these books." The front lawn was scattered with folding tables bearing the organized remnants of someone's life. Dishes, linens, framed photographs of people whose names were now forgotten. And books. So many books. Maya gravitated toward them the way she always did. Steinbeck, Hemingway, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird with notes in the margins. Someone had loved these. Someone had underlined passages in dog-eared pages and returned to favorite chapters on rainy afternoons. $5 for the whole box, said the woman running the sale. She was perhaps 60, efficient and kind. My mother passed last year, finally getting around to clearing things out. Maya paid without hesitation, and Sophie helped her load the box into the trunk. They drove back to Maya's place, a small rental cottage with good light and creaky floors. The kind of place that felt temporary but comfortable, like a held breath. Inside, Sophie made tea while Maya unpacked the books, running her fingers along their spines with the reverence of someone who understood that books were more than paper and ink. They were doorways. They were companions. They were proof that someone else had once felt what you were feeling now. She was halfway through the box when something slipped from between the pages of a hardcover collection of Robert Frost poems. An envelope, cream-colored and aged, unsealed. "What's that?" Sophie peered over her shoulder. "A letter, I think." Maya pulled it out carefully. The paper was delicate, the handwriting masculine and deliberate. "Should we?" "Absolutely we should," Sophie said, settling onto the couch with her tea. "What if it's a love letter? What if it's a mystery? What if someone needs to know about it?" Maya smiled despite herself and unfolded the pages. They read together, Sophie leaning close, both of them falling quiet as the words revealed themselves. May 15th, 1976. Dear Jane, I'm writing to you because you're the only person in the world who will understand what I'm about to say without judging me for it. You've always been that person. Ever since we were kids building that fort in your backyard, and you told me it was okay to cry when I scraped my knee, even though boys weren't supposed to. I'm confused, Jane. I know I need to make a decision, and I know I'm running out of time to make it. But every time I try to think clearly, I just end up more tangled than before. Adelaide is extraordinary. You know that. Everyone knows that. When she walks into a room, she changes the air in it. She's brilliant and ambitious, and she makes me want to be better than I am. When I'm with her, I feel like I could build bridges that span oceans, design buildings that touch the sky. She challenges me in ways no one else does. But there's always a but, isn't there? When we're together, I sometimes feel like I'm performing, like I'm trying to be the version of myself she deserves, rather than just being myself. Does that make sense? And her dreams are so big, Jane. New York, Paris, places I've never even thought about. I'm not sure I want to leave Willow Creek. I know that probably sounds small to someone like Adelaide. Then there's Susan. Susan is everything I thought I wanted when I imagined getting married someday. She's kind and steady, and she wants the same things I think I want. A house, a family, Sunday dinners, and holiday traditions. She'd be a wonderful wife and mother. Everyone says so. My mother absolutely adores her. But when we're together, when we talk, I find myself wishing for something I can't quite name. More depth? More laughter? I don't know. It feels like we're reading from a script someone else wrote. Everything is pleasant and appropriate, and somehow not quite real. I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me that if I'm uncertain about both of them, then maybe neither one is right. That's what you said last week when we were walking by the river and I was going on and on about this whole mess. But Jane, I'm 21 years old. I should be able to figure this out. I should know what love is supposed to feel like. You asked me then what I was looking for. I couldn't answer. I still can't. I just know that when I imagine my future, I can't quite see it clearly with either of them. But I also can't imagine not choosing. I can't stay in this limbo forever. So I'm asking you, my oldest and best friend, the person who knows me better than anyone, what do I do? How do I choose? What if I choose wrong? Write back when you can. Or better yet, let's meet at the diner on Friday. I'll buy you that chocolate milkshake you like, and you can tell me I'm overthinking everything. You always did see things more clearly than I do. Your confused and grateful friend, Robert. The silence after they finished reading felt heavy with significance. Wow, Sophie breathed. That's intense. Maya turned the envelope over, examining the address. Mrs. J. Morrison, 428 Sycamore Street. The house they'd just left. She looked at the postmark. 1976. 50 years ago. Do you think she ever got it? Sophie wondered aloud. Or do you think it was returned, and she just kept it in this book all these years? Only one way to find out, Maya said, standing up with sudden decision. We should return it. Maya, it's almost 6 o'clock. Then we'll go tomorrow, first thing. She held the letter carefully, as though it were made of glass. Wouldn't you want it back if it were yours? This isn't just any letter. Someone poured their heart into this. Sophie smiled, that particular smile that meant she was pleased with her new friend's instincts. Okay, tomorrow, first thing. But neither of them could have predicted what they were about to discover. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of light that makes everything look softer, more forgiving. Maya and Sophie stood on the porch of 428 Sycamore Street, the letter carefully placed in a manila envelope to protect it. The woman who answered the door was not the one who had run the estate sale. She was older, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes that were still remarkably bright. She wore a cardigan despite the mild weather and held a cup of tea that sent small spirals of steam into the air. Can I help you? Her voice was warm, curious rather than wary. Mrs. Morrison, Maya asked. We bought some books from your sale yesterday. We're sorry to disturb you on a Sunday, but we found something we thought you might want back. The woman's expression shifted slightly. I'm Maya Torres. This is Sophie Chen. We live nearby. Come in, please. Jane stepped aside, gesturing them into a living room that felt like stepping into a memory. The furniture was old but well maintained, the kind of pieces that were made to last generations. Photographs lined the mantel and the walls, chronicling a life in careful chronology. Maya handed her the envelope. We found this in a poetry book, Robert Frost. It was tucked between the pages. Jane's hands paused as she took it. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she simply held it, her fingers tracing the outline of the letter inside, as though reading it through touch alone. I wondered where this had gone, she said softly. I thought I'd lost it years ago, probably packed it into that book for safekeeping and then forgot. She looked up at them, and something in her expression made Maya's breath catch. Thank you for returning it. Sophie, who had never been one for subtlety, leaned forward slightly. We didn't mean to read it. Well, we did read it. I'm sorry. But it was so beautiful, and we were curious, and... It's all right, Jane interrupted gently, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Letters that old don't come with privacy anymore. They become artifacts. Maya gathered her courage. Mrs. Morrison, if you don't mind my asking, is the letter from your husband? It is. So your husband's name was Robert? Yes. Jane's smile deepened, as though she knew where this was going and was enjoying the journey. Sophie couldn't contain herself any longer. Were you Adelaide or Susan? The silence that followed was profound. Jane looked at them both, her eyes dancing with something that might have been amusement, or might have been the kind of joy that comes from a story told well. Neither, dear, she said finally. My name is Jane. Maya felt the words land like a physical thing. Sophie's mouth actually fell open. Jane? Maya repeated, needing to be sure she'd heard correctly. As in, the friend he was writing to? The very same. But that means... Jane set her teacup down on the coffee table with careful precision. That means I was the one he couldn't see. Until one day he did. Would you like to hear the story? She looked at them both, her expression warm and inviting. I don't tell it often, but it seems like today might be the right day. If you have time? Maya and Sophie exchanged glances. Maya thought about the article she was supposed to be writing about the new traffic light on Main Street. Sophie thought about the freelance design work waiting on her laptop. We have time, they said in unison. Good. Jane stood, moving with the grace of someone who had lived in their body long enough to know its rhythms. Let me make more tea, and perhaps some cookies. This story requires cookies. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Maya and Sophie alone in the living room. They looked at each other with the kind of excitement that comes from stumbling onto something unexpected and true. This is incredible, Sophie whispered. This is a story, Maya corrected, her journalist's instincts already cataloging details, sensing the shape of something worth telling. Jane returned with a tray bearing a fresh pot of tea, 3 delicate china cups, and a plate of sugar cookies that looked homemade. She settled into the armchair that had clearly been hers for many years, the cushion bearing the subtle impression of her presence. Robert and I grew up together, she began, and her voice took on the quality of someone reaching back through time, pulling memories forward like photographs from a drawer. We were neighbors. His family lived 3 doors down, in the White House with the blue shutters. You can still see it from here if you look out that window. She pointed, and they all turned to look. The house was still there, exactly as described, as though waiting patiently to be part of the story. We met when I was 4 and he was 5. His family had just moved to Willow Creek from somewhere in Ohio. He was shy at first, hiding behind his mother's skirt when she came to introduce herself to my parents. But I marched right up to him and said, "Do you want to see my tree house?" And that was that. Jane smiled, the kind of smile that holds decades in it. From that day on, we were inseparable. We built forts in the woods behind our houses. We caught frogs in the creek. We made up elaborate games with rules only we understood. When my cat died, he helped me bury her in the backyard and made a little wooden cross to mark the spot. When he broke his arm falling out of a tree, I was the first one he told, even before his parents. She paused to pour tea for all of them, the amber liquid streaming into the cups with practiced ease. We went through school together, elementary, middle, high school. We were always just friends, best friends certainly, but that's all either of us thought it was. Everyone used to ask if we were dating, and we'd laugh and say no. We were like siblings. The idea of being anything else seemed absurd. "But you must have had feelings for him," Sophie ventured. "At some point?" Jane considered this, tilting her head slightly. "That's the interesting thing. I don't think I did. Not romantically, not at first. I loved him, absolutely, but it was the love of deep friendship, the love of knowing someone's stories and secrets and dreams. I never looked at him and thought, I wish he would kiss me. I looked at him and thought, I'm glad he exists in my world." She took a sip of her tea, letting the memory settle. But then we went to college. Same college, different majors. I was studying English literature. Robert was in the engineering program. And that's when things got complicated. Maya leaned forward, completely absorbed. This was what she loved about journalism when it was done right. The human stories, the moments that made people who they were. "That's when he met Adelaide and Susan," Jane continued. "And everything changed." Jane set her teacup down and folded her hands in her lap, gathering the threads of memory. Adelaide Parker arrived in the fall of our sophomore year like a storm in human form. Transfer student from Columbia, though why she left New York for our little college in the middle of nowhere, none of us ever quite understood. She said she wanted to experience real America, whatever that meant. She was studying art history and spoke 3 languages and wore scarves in ways that looked effortless, but probably weren't. Jane's voice held no bitterness, only observation. She was magnetic. That's the only word for it. When she walked into a room, conversations paused. Not because she demanded attention, but because she simply commanded it by existing. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't afraid to share them. She organized protests, painted murals, wrote for the student paper. She was alive in a way that made everyone else feel a little bit muted by comparison. And Robert fell for her, Sophie guessed. Immediately and completely. I remember the day they met. It was at a campus lecture about urban renewal. I dragged Robert along because I thought it would be interesting, even though engineering students rarely attended liberal arts events. Adelaide asked a question that challenged the speaker's entire premise, and she did it so eloquently that the whole room erupted in applause. Robert leaned over to me and whispered, "Who is that?" Jane smiled, but something flickered across her face. I should have known then. I should have recognized what was happening, but I didn't, or I didn't want to. What do you mean? Maya asked gently. I mean that I helped him. I introduced them after the lecture. I facilitated their first conversation. I told Adelaide that Robert was brilliant with spatial design, which was true. I told Robert that Adelaide was fascinating, which was also true. And I watched them light up at each other, and I felt proud of myself for being such a good friend. She paused, reaching for her tea. It was only later, lying in bed that night, that I felt this strange hollowness in my chest. I told myself it was just adjustment. My best friend was falling in love. That was natural. That was good. I should be happy for him. But you weren't, Sophie said softly. I was, and I wasn't. It's possible to feel both things at once, I learned. To genuinely want someone's happiness while also mourning what that happiness changes in your own life. Robert started spending less time with me. Not deliberately, not cruelly. He was just swept up in Adelaide's world. They went to gallery openings and poetry readings and late-night diners where they'd talk until dawn about art and purpose and how to change the world. Beautiful, important conversations. The kind I would have loved to have. But I wasn't invited. Jane looked out the window, as though she could see her younger self standing there, confused and hurting and not understanding why. Susan came into the picture a few months later. She was different from Adelaide in every conceivable way. Where Adelaide was a storm, Susan was sunshine. Gentle, warm, predictable. She sang in the church choir. She volunteered at the children's hospital. She wore sweet floral dresses and always remembered everyone's birthday. She was the kind of person who made you feel safe. And Robert was attracted to that too? Maya asked. Eventually, yes. Things with Adelaide burned hot but unstable. They'd have passionate debates that would turn into arguments. Adelaide wanted to move to New York after graduation. Robert wanted to stay in the region, maybe work in the city, but live somewhere quieter. Adelaide thought his dreams were too small. Robert thought her ambitions would consume everything else. They broke up and got back together 3 times in 6 months. Jane smiled ruefully. And every time they broke up, Robert would come to me. We'd walk by the river or sit in the library, and he'd pour his heart out. He'd say Adelaide was impossible. He'd say she made him feel inadequate. He'd say he wanted something simpler, easier. That's when he noticed Susan. Yes, Susan was in my Victorian literature class. She'd borrow my notes when she missed lectures, and we became friendly. She was lovely, truly, kind and thoughtful and sincere. When she started showing interest in Robert, I mentioned it to him. I thought maybe he needed to date someone who wouldn't set him on fire but would keep him warm. That probably sounds terrible. It sounds like you were trying to help, Maya said. I was. But I was also trying to make sense of my own feelings, which I still didn't fully understand. Robert started dating Susan shortly after his final breakup with Adelaide. It was calmer, steadier. They'd have quiet dinners and take long walks. His mother adored her. Susan fit into Robert's life like a puzzle piece sliding into place. But, Sophie prompted. But Robert seemed restless. He'd call me at odd hours, wanting to talk about nothing in particular. He'd show up at my dorm room with coffee and we'd end up talking for hours about books and philosophy and whether it was possible to be happy without being passionate about something. With Susan, he said, everything was pleasant. Nice. but nice wasn't enough. Jane stood and walked to the mantel, picking up a framed photograph. She brought it back to show them. A young woman with long brown hair and an open, intelligent face, standing in front of a college building. She was laughing at something off camera. That's me. Spring of 1976. I was 21. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I was just Robert's friend, his confidant, his sounding board. I thought I was content with that role. She set the photo down gently. That's what I told myself when he wrote that letter. The one you found. He'd given it to me on a Friday afternoon, asked me to read it and give him my honest thoughts. I took it back to my room and I read it alone. What did you feel? Maya asked quietly. Jane was quiet for a long moment. I cried, she said finally. I sat on my narrow dorm room bed with that letter in my hands, and I cried. Because I'd finally understood what that hollow feeling in my chest had been all along. I'd been in love with Robert for years, maybe forever, and he had no idea. And I couldn't tell him, because he was asking me to help him choose between two other women. The admission hung in the air like a confession. So what did you do? Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. I did what any good friend would do. Jane's smile was sad. I wrote back. I told him that if he wasn't sure about either Adelaide or Susan, then maybe neither was right. I told him that love should feel clear, not confusing, that the right person wouldn't make him question so much. All the wise, sensible advice a friend should give. But you didn't tell him how you felt. No, I didn't tell him. Because by then, I'd convinced myself that it didn't matter. That even if I said something, he'd never see me that way. I was just Jane, his childhood friend. The one who'd always been there, so familiar that I'd become invisible. Jane returned to her chair, settling back into it with a sigh. Robert read my letter and said I was right. He needed to stop forcing something that didn't feel natural with either Adelaide or Susan. They were both wonderful women, but they weren't right for him. So he ended things with Susan gently, and Adelaide had already left for New York by then anyway. And life went on. And you stayed friends, Maya said. We stayed friends, best friends. We had 6 months left of college. We fell back into our old patterns. Study sessions, late-night conversations, walking across campus together. Everyone still asked if we were dating, and we still laughed and said no. But something had changed for me. I couldn't unknow what I now knew about my own heart. That must have been painful. It was. But it was also bearable. Because having Robert in my life as a friend was better than not having him at all. I'd made my peace with it. Or so I thought. Jane picked up another photograph, this one more formal. A young man in a suit, handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes and a sincere smile. This is Robert, age 21, 6 months before everything changed. Sophie leaned forward. What changed it? Jane's smile transformed her face, years falling away. A dinner party, and a dress, and the moment Robert finally saw me. It was November, Jane began, her voice taking on the quality of someone reliving rather than remembering. November 14th, 1976 to be exact. I won a literary award. Nothing major. Just a small regional competition for an essay I'd written about Emily Dickinson's use of silence as a form of communication. But the English department was hosting a formal dinner to honor the winners, and we were each allowed to bring a guest. She smiled at the memory. I didn't have anyone to ask. I dated a few boys in college, but nothing serious, nothing that lasted. And most of my friends were girls who were bringing their boyfriends or dates. I didn't want to go alone. I thought about not going at all, making up some excuse. But Professor Whitman had been so kind to me, so encouraging of my writing, and I didn't want to disappoint him. So you asked Robert, Maya said. So I asked Robert. I remember calling him on a Tuesday night. He'd already graduated by then and was working at an engineering firm in the city, about an hour away. He'd come visit sometimes on weekends, but we saw each other less than we had in school. When I explained about the dinner, he didn't hesitate. Jane's expression softened. Of course I'll come, he said. Wouldn't miss it for anything. My best friend winning an award? I'll wear my good suit. And I remember laughing and saying he didn't need to make a fuss. It was just a small thing. And he said, Jane, when have you ever asked me for anything? I'm there. She paused to take a breath, steadying herself. That Saturday, I did something I'd never done before. I went shopping for a dress. Not just any dress. I went to the nice boutique downtown, the one with the expensive window displays that I usually walked past without looking. I told myself it was for the award, for the formal occasion. But I knew, somewhere deep down, that I was doing it for him. What did you choose? Sophie asked, completely engrossed. It was dark green, forest green, like the woods we used to play in as children. Velvet. Simple but elegant, with a neckline that showed my collarbones and sleeves that came to just above my elbows. It cost more than I'd spent on clothes in a year, but the moment I saw myself in the mirror, I knew it was right. I looked like a woman, not a girl. I looked like someone who might be worth seeing. Jane's voice grew quieter. I did my hair differently, too. Usually I just wore it down or in a ponytail, practical and simple. But that night, I pinned it up, leaving a few soft pieces framing my face. I borrowed pearl earrings from my roommate. I put on makeup, which I almost never wore. Lipstick, a little blush. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself, and I was terrified. Terrified of what? Maya asked. Of hoping. Of wanting something I'd convinced myself I couldn't have. What if I did all this and Robert still didn't see me? What if I was just his friend Jane, playing dress-up for an evening? The thought of that hurt worse than not trying at all. I almost changed back into something more familiar. But my roommate stopped me. She said, Jane Morrison, you look beautiful. Go show that boy what he's been missing. Jane stood again, moving to a drawer in the antique sideboard. She pulled out a small album and flipped through it until she found what she was looking for. She handed the photograph to Maya and Sophie. It showed a young woman standing in front of a mirror, captured in profile. The green dress, the upswept hair, the nervous and hopeful expression. My roommate took this before Robert arrived to pick me up. She said I should have proof that I'd been brave, even if nothing came of it. In the photograph, young Jane looked luminous. Robert arrived at 7. I heard his knock and took one last deep breath. When I opened the door, Jane's voice caught slightly. He just stopped, froze completely on the threshold. He was holding flowers, daisies from the supermarket, simple and sweet, and he stared at me like he'd never seen me before. She closed her eyes, remembering. Jane, he said, like he wasn't sure. Is that you? I felt myself blushing, suddenly self-conscious. Who else would it be? I tried to joke, but my voice came out breathless. He kept staring and I got more nervous. Is it too much? I can change. I have other dresses, more casual ones. I just thought since it was formal, No, he interrupted. And his voice sounded strange, rougher than usual. No, don't change. You look, Jane, you look beautiful. He'd told me I looked nice before in the casual way friends do, but this was different. The way he said it, the way he looked at me. Something had shifted in that moment. Something fundamental. Jane opened her eyes, looking at Maya and Sophie. We went to the dinner. He drove, and we barely spoke on the way there. The silence was different than our usual comfortable quiet. It was charged with something neither of us knew how to name. At the dinner, everything changed. The department had rented out a room at the nicest restaurant in town. There were round tables with white tablecloths and candles, and a small podium where each winner would read from their winning essay. I was nervous about reading, but having Robert there steadied me. When it was my turn, I stood at the podium and looked out at the room full of professors and students and strangers. But my eyes found Robert's, and he smiled at me in that way he'd smiled at me 1,000 times before. Except this time there was something else in it, something new. I read my essay. It was about how Dickinson used dashes and blank spaces to create meaning, how sometimes what isn't said speaks louder than what is, how silence can be its own form of poetry. When I finished, the room applauded, but I only cared about Robert's reaction. He was beaming, proud, but also thoughtful, like he was hearing my words on multiple levels. Jane returned to her chair, settling into the story's rhythm. After the ceremony, there was a reception, wine and small talk. My professor introduced me to other academics, and I found myself in my element, discussing literature and interpretation with people who understood. And Robert stood beside me, listening, watching. Later, he told me he'd never seen me like that before. Confident, articulate, commanding a room with ideas instead of just being part of the background. He said it was like watching someone step into light after years of standing in shadow. He said I was magnificent. But I didn't know that yet. At the time, I just knew that every time I glanced at him, he was already looking at me. And when someone asked if he was my boyfriend, and I started to correct them, he didn't. He just smiled and said, "We're old friends, the oldest." But the way he said it made it sound like a question he was asking himself. The dinner ended around 10. Robert drove me back to the dorms, and we sat in his car outside my building. The heat was running, and the windows had fogged up slightly. I should have said goodnight and gone inside, but I didn't want the evening to end. "That was really something, Jane," Robert said. He wasn't looking at me, just staring out through the windshield at nothing in particular. "Your essay, the way you explained it." I never thought about silence that way before, as something active instead of just absence. "That's what Dickinson understood," I said. "That sometimes the most important things exist in the spaces between words." He turned to look at me then, and there was something in his expression that made my heart race. "Jane," he said slowly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did I never see you?" The question hung in the air between us. I didn't pretend not to understand what he meant. "You were looking elsewhere," I said quietly. "I was," he agreed. I was looking so hard at what I thought I should want that I missed what was right in front of me. My breath caught. "Robert, can I take you to dinner?" he interrupted. "A real dinner, not as friends, as something else, something more, if you want that." I must have looked shocked because he started backtracking. "I'm sorry. This is probably weird. We've been friends forever, and I'm ruining it, and you probably don't think of me that way, and—" "Yes," I said, cutting off his spiral. "Yes, I want that. I've wanted that for longer than you know." He looked at me like I'd given him something precious. Yeah. We sat there for another minute, neither of us quite knowing what to do next. Then he laughed, this surprised, delighted sound. "How are we suddenly nervous around each other?" "Because everything just changed," I said. "Is that okay?" "Yes," I said. And then, because it needed to be said, more than okay. Jane smiled at Maya and Sophie, who were both leaning forward, completely absorbed. He walked me to my door. We didn't kiss that night. It felt too soon, too much. But before I went inside, he took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Friday night?" he asked. "I'll pick you up at 7. "It's a date," I said. "An actual date," he confirmed, grinning like he'd just discovered something wonderful. "An actual date," I agreed. "And that," Jane said, "was the beginning of everything." "That first real date was both strange and perfectly natural," Jane continued, her voice warm with memory. "We went to the same diner we'd been to 100 times before. We sat in the same booth by the window that we always chose. We even ordered the same things we usually ordered. But everything felt different because we both knew it was different. We talked for 3 hours, about everything and nothing, about how weird it was to be on a date with each other, about when we'd each started feeling something shift. He said it had been building for months without him realizing it. All those times he'd called me late at night, all those hours we'd spent talking, the way he'd felt empty when we weren't together. He'd thought he was just missing his best friend. He didn't understand it was something more. Jane's smile was soft. I told him about crying over his letter, about realizing I'd been in love with him and not knowing what to do with that knowledge, about trying to be happy for him when he dated Adelaide and Susan, and how hard that had been. He looked horrified that I'd been hurting, and he hadn't seen it. "I'm an idiot," he said. "A complete and total idiot." "You were searching," I told him. "There's no shame in that. We both needed to get here in our own time." He reached across the table and took my hand, just held it, right there in the diner where everyone could see. It was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't want to mess this up," he said. "You're too important to me." "Then don't mess it up," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "That's helpful advice," he laughed. And just like that, the tension broke, and we were us again, just with this new dimension added. Jane paused to refill the teacups, the ritual giving weight to the memory. We dated for a year before he proposed. A whole year of learning how to be both best friends and something more. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes we'd slip into old patterns and forget we were supposed to be romantic. Other times we'd try too hard to be romantic and feel silly. But slowly, we found our rhythm. We'd have date nights where we'd dress up and go somewhere nice, and then we'd have lazy Saturdays where we'd just exist together, comfortable and content. We learned how to kiss, which sounds funny, but it's true. Our first kiss was awkward because we were both overthinking it. By our 100th kiss, it felt like breathing. His family was thrilled. His mother literally cried when Robert told her we were dating. She said she'd been hoping for years that we'd figure it out. My father was more reserved, but he approved. He'd always liked Robert, trusted him. That mattered more than I'd realized. Sophie wiped at her eyes. "This is so beautiful." "It was simple," Jane corrected gently. "Not fairy tale perfect, just real. And that made it better." He proposed on the first anniversary of that formal dinner, November 14th, 1977. He took me back to the spot where we'd built our childhood fort, which was now just a clearing in the woods, but it still felt sacred somehow. All our memories lived there. It was cold that day, November in New England, and I remember shivering even in my heavy coat. He'd told me we were just going for a walk, but when we got to the clearing, I saw he'd been there earlier. He'd strung up lights in the trees, battery-powered ones that twinkled in the fading afternoon light. He'd spread a blanket and brought thermoses of hot chocolate. "What's all this?" I asked, even though I was starting to suspect. "This is where it all started," he said. "Where we became us. I wanted to ask you something here, in this place that's always been ours." He got down on one knee, right there on the blanket, and pulled out a small velvet box. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from nerves. "Jane Morrison," he said, "you've been my best friend since I was 5 years old. You've known me longer and better than anyone else in the world. You've seen me at my worst, and somehow still think I'm worth keeping around. And you're the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. Not because it's comfortable, though it is. Not because it makes sense, though it does. But because being with you feels like being home. You're my home, Jane. You always have been." Jane's voice had grown softer, almost reverent. Then he opened the box, and inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing extravagant, just right. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Will you keep being my best friend and also become my wife? Will you build a life with me?" I was crying by then. Happy tears, the kind that blur the world into something softer and brighter. "Yes," I said. "Yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly. Of course it fit perfectly. Everything about us had always fit, once we'd finally admitted it. We were married 6 months later, in May of 1978. Small wedding, just family and close friends in the church where we'd both been baptized. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me. Robert wore a simple gray suit that made his eyes look impossibly blue. When we said our vows, I saw him crying, which made me cry, which made half the congregation cry. The reception was in my parents' backyard. String lights and folding tables, and my mother's friends bringing casseroles and pies. Someone had borrowed a record player, and we danced to Fleetwood Mac. Songbird, not Landslide. Something softer, more certain. That night, our first night as husband and wife, we lay in bed in the small apartment Robert had rented for us, and we just talked. Same as we'd done 1,000 times before, except now we had matching rings and a future laid out before us like a map we'd get to draw together. "Are you happy?" he asked me. "Impossibly happy," I said. "Me too," he replied. And then, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you." "Stop apologizing for that," I told him. "We got here when we were ready. That's enough." Jane's expression grew distant, seeing across decades. We had a good life. Not perfect, never perfect, but good. Real. We bought a house, this house, 2 years after we married. It needed work, but Robert was handy and I was patient. We fixed it up room by room, making it ours. Our children came next. Sarah in 1980, Michael in 1982. 2 beautiful, healthy babies who became curious toddlers, and then thoughtful children, and finally complicated adults with their own lives and dreams. Robert was a wonderful father, patient and present in ways his own father hadn't been. He worked as an engineer for the same firm his entire career, 40 years with the same company. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he liked the work, and it let him come home every night to us. He designed bridges and water systems and buildings that are still standing today. He made a difference in quiet ways. I became a librarian finally, got my master's degree while the kids were young, worked part-time until they were in school, then full-time until I retired. I helped people find stories that spoke to them. I ran reading programs for children. I created a space where people could come and simply exist among books and silence. Every Friday night, Robert and I had date night. Even when the kids were little, we'd get a babysitter or leave them with my mother. We'd go to dinner or see a movie or just drive to the coast and walk on the beach. We protected that time, kept it sacred. It was how we remembered to stay us, not just parents or employees or responsible adults. We traveled, but not far. Cape Cod in summer, Vermont in fall. Sometimes New York for a weekend to see shows or museums. We talked about going to Europe someday, but we never quite made it. We were happy where we were. The years passed, they always do. Sarah married a kind man who makes her laugh. Michael found his calling as a teacher. The grandchildren arrived, 4 of them in total. Robert retired at 65. I followed a year later. We had plans, trips to take, books to read, gardens to tend. Jane's voice grew quieter. We had 15 years of retirement together. 15 years of slow mornings and afternoon naps and doing nothing much at all. It was glorious. We'd sit on this porch at sunset, holding hands, not needing to fill the silence. He kept that letter, the one you found. He'd framed it at some point, hung it in his office. He said it was a reminder of how blind I was, he told me once, and how lucky I got despite myself. Last year, on a Tuesday morning in March, he didn't wake up. Peaceful, the doctor said. Heart attack in his sleep. No pain, no warning. Just there one moment and gone the next. I held his hand and I knew. That particular coldness. That absence. He'd been my best friend for 66 years and my husband for 48. And suddenly he was just gone. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered. "Don't be," Jane said, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I had him. All those years I had him. That's more than many people get. And I have our children and grandchildren. I have memories so thick they could fill a library. I have this house we built together, these photographs, these stories. He didn't leave me with nothing. He left me with everything that mattered. She looked at Maya and Sophie with clear eyes. That's what I want you to understand. This story isn't tragic. Yes, I lost him, but I had him. For 48 years, I woke up next to my best friend. For 48 years, I was loved completely and well. How many people can say that? Not many, Maya said softly. Exactly, Jane agreed. So yes, I grieve. I miss him every single day, but I don't regret a single moment. Not the years I spent loving him while he looked at other girls. Not the fear I felt on that first date. Not the ordinary days that felt too simple to matter but actually mattered most of all. She stood, stretching slightly. That's the story. That's how Robert and I happened. Not with fireworks and grand gestures, but with friendship that grew into something more. With patience and finally seeing what had been there all along. Maya spent the next 3 days writing. Not because the article was difficult, but because she wanted to honor Jane and Robert properly. Every word needed to carry the weight of what they'd shared. She wrote at her kitchen table, the Robert Frost poetry book open beside her laptop. The article came together like a story that had been waiting to be told. She wrote about the letter found between pages, about 2 young women returning it to its owner, about the revelation that sometimes love stories don't begin with lightning strikes, but with finally seeing what's always been there. On Wednesday, she drove to Jane's house with the draft. Jane read it slowly, sitting in her armchair by the window. When she finished, she folded the pages carefully and looked up with bright eyes. "You got it right," she said simply. "Every word. Robert would have loved this." The article ran in Friday's Willow Creek Gazette. By afternoon, the paper's website had crashed from traffic. People were sharing it everywhere. Maya's inbox filled with messages from strangers. "I've been waiting for my best friend to notice me for 3 years," one woman wrote. "Your article made me realize I need to actually tell him." "I'm 68 and divorced," another said. "I thought love was over for me. But reading about Jane gives me hope. A man in his 40s. My wife and I started as friends. This reminded me why that matters. I'm taking her to dinner tonight." On Saturday morning, Maya visited Jane to share some of the responses. She found her in the garden, tending the roses Robert had planted. "You've made quite an impact," Maya said. Jane looked up from her work, dirt on her gloves. "Have I?" Maya read several messages aloud. When she finished, Jane sat back, quiet. "I never thought our story was particularly special," Jane said. "It was just our life." "That's exactly why it's special," Maya replied. "Because it's real. Because people can see themselves in it." That evening, Sophie called Maya, breathless with news. "I told him. I told Ethan how I feel." "What did he say?" "He was surprised. But he asked for time to think about it. Really think about it." Sophie's voice was shaky but hopeful. "That's better than no, right? At least he's considering it." "That's brave, Sophie. However it turns out, you were brave." 3 months later, spring arrived in Willow Creek with gentle insistence. Maya had become a regular visitor to Jane's house, not just for stories, but for friendship. They were sitting on the porch on a Saturday in late April when Sophie's car pulled up. Sophie got out, and Ethan got out with her. "Mrs. Morrison," Sophie called, climbing the steps. "I wanted you to meet someone." Ethan was kind-faced with an easy smile and eyes that kept finding Sophie's. He shook Jane's hand warmly. "It's an honor," he said. "Sophie told me about your story, about how it gave her courage to tell me how she felt." "And did it work out?" Jane asked, though the answer was obvious in how they stood together. "It did," Sophie beamed. "Turns out we were both too scared to speak up. Until we weren't." "I'm happy for you both," Jane said genuinely. "I hope you'll be very happy together." When they left hand in hand, Maya and Jane sat in comfortable silence. "That's the thing about true stories," Jane said. "They give people permission." Sophie needed to know it was possible. That speaking up was worth the risk. Maya had been waiting for the right moment. She pulled a folder from her bag. "The publisher sent this." Inside was a mock-up. "Always Jane, love letters and life lessons." Beneath the title was the photograph of Jane and Robert from their grandchild's graduation, holding hands, looking at each other instead of the camera. "A book?" Jane's hands trembled slightly. "They want to expand the article. Include Robert's letter. Include your wisdom about patience and dignity. Letters from people you've helped." Maya paused. "They think it could really help people, but only if you want to." Jane was quiet for a long moment. "Let me think about it. Talk to my children." 2 weeks later, she called. "I'll do it. But the proceeds go to literacy programs. Robert and I believed in libraries, in stories, in words that matter. If our story becomes a book, I want it to help create more readers." "Done," Maya said. The book was published in October. Small press, but they did it beautifully. The launch was at the Willow Creek Library. Every seat filled. Jane spoke briefly. "Robert and I had a simple life. We were lucky, and we were intentional. We chose each other every day, even when it was hard. If our story helps even one person see that quiet love is just as valuable as dramatic love, that patience is not settling, that friendship is the best foundation, then sharing it was worth it." The applause was warm and long. As the crowd thinned, an elegant older woman approached hesitantly. "Jane Morrison." Jane looked up. "Adelaide?" They embraced like old friends reunited across decades. "I read the article," Adelaide said. "And the book. I had no idea about your feelings for Robert, about any of it. If I had known..." "It wouldn't have mattered," Jane said gently. "You couldn't help how he felt about you. You weren't the villain, Adelaide. You were just a person living your life. Still, I'm sorry if I caused you pain." "You didn't. Life causes pain sometimes, and joy other times. You were part of that, but not responsible for it." They talked briefly. Adelaide had never married, had a brilliant career as a curator, traveled the world. "No regrets," she said. But she'd always remembered Robert fondly. "He was a good man," Adelaide said. "The best," Jane agreed. "And in the end, he was mine." Later, as the library closed, Maya helped Jane to her car. "Quite a day," Maya said. "Quite a life," Jane corrected with a smile. "I never imagined when you knocked on my door with that letter that it would lead to all this. Do you regret sharing everything?" "No. Robert's gone, but this keeps him alive, keeps our love alive. And if it helps people, gives them courage or hope, or just permission to be patient with themselves, then it's a gift." Maya watched Jane drive away, then went home to her cottage. The Frost book sat on her desk. She opened it randomly and found another underlined passage she'd never noticed. "In 3 words, I can sum up everything I've learned about life." It goes on. Beneath it, in Jane's handwriting, was a date, March 2025, a month after Robert died. And beneath that, 2 words. "It does." Outside, Willow Creek settled into evening. Lights came on in windows. Families gathered. Couples walked hand in hand. Life continued in its simple, sacred way. And in a house on Sycamore Street, an old woman sat with tea and photographs of her beloved, grateful for what she'd had. grateful for what she'd learned, grateful that even in loss, love remained. Always Jane. That's what Robert had called her. In early years, testing the sound. In middle years, with comfortable certainty. In final years, with tender gratitude. Always Jane. And though he was gone, she remained. Still here, still living, still loving in the way you love when someone has shaped you so completely that they live on in every choice you make, every kindness you offer, every story you tell. The book would reach people. The story would ripple outward. Somewhere, someone would read about Jane and Robert and would look at their own life differently, would see what had been invisible, would speak up or walk away or wait patiently or choose bravely. One story, one ordinary life, one extraordinary love. It was enough. It was everything.